Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Bible study and episode review in Shady Oak Ministries. I'm, of course, Shady Oak, and today we'll be going over episode 19 of season 1 of the TV show My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, the dog and pony show. A real rarity specialty episode, and one that goes definitely as an ode out to the Pegasisters or Bronettes, or simply Bronies who would identify themselves as the female gender in our quite expansive fan base, regardless of where you're standing or what your preference is to be called. This episode and the Bible verse that I believe inspired this episode goes out specifically to you, and quite directly in more ways than one. Proverbs chapter 31, verses 10 through 31, are the words of Solomon's mother, or rather referred to him as King Lemuel. We believe this was a nickname for Solomon, but we can't confirm anything. History aside, this is words of wisdom spoken in concluding the book of Proverbs, and it's all about what makes a woman a godly woman. Who can find a virtuous wife? For her worth is far above rubies. That is verse 10. And I think it points out a lot more just in recognizing that alone. Rarity's calling was a fascination with diamonds, and yet the virtuous wife from a biblical standpoint is compared to nothing more than a precious gem. And Rarity definitely was able to identify with that. But before we get into a verse-by-verse study of this 31st book, of this 31st chapter of this book of wisdom, written by Solomon and inspired by the Holy Spirit, I want to emphasize that these things that we're going to be going over as a godly woman is concerned, don't think I'm going to beat your head with this, because it's not meant to be attainable. It's the same way that you should look at this as a man should look to comparing himself to Jesus Christ. That's a godly man. So if one guy ever thinks, yes, my character is fully attained and being exactly a reflection of Jesus Christ's character, then he's probably got to go back to step one. The same thing is true in both scenarios. It's not meant to be, this is our checklist of what our characters need to be like, but it's something that we should constantly be revisiting and going back to as far as where we stand in our life in pursuing God, because these will be literally the ideal checklist of what's going to come out of your life in pursuing God, especially as a woman. Now, you can tell there's a male voice speaking. I can't make any claims to understand or fully comprehend you, but your Creator does. So don't take my word for it. Don't take my insight. Simply take the wisdom as it stands and know that God has you well in mind in his heart. So again, starting, who can find a virtuous wife? Verse 10. For her worth is far above rubies. She's, well, definitely a rarity to come by. And in this episode, the entirety of everything that made up Rarity who she was. No, it wasn't perfect in every way, but she expressed all of these character values, even in the most briefest of moments, by her values. And it was by that we also saw her strength. Verse 11, it says, the heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. Fine example of something not meant to be attainable 100% 24/7. But the point is that a godly woman is trustworthy. She's not marrying a man for his wallet. She's not trying to take advantage of people, even if she never does get married. But she recognizes where real value lies. It's not in what she can get out of people, but what comes from her herself. In fact, quick jump into the New Testament. In the book of Romans chapter 12 and verse 17, Paul emphasized the value of character and what it looks like to behave just as a Christian in general, for guys and girls both. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in doing so, you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. All of this is centering around relationships and how you interact with other people. And especially as far as the epitome of social climate that girls tend to be at their base value. Now, there are always exceptions, just as there are on the male side, but the point is being made. The heart is more important than any hobby or career. Rarity recognized that her true value came from within, not necessarily in what she could produce out of her career, though that would be a result. It was her honest integrity in how she worked and providing for her family that mattered, and we'll go into that in the following verses to come. Verse 13, she seeks wool and flax, and willingly works with her hands. She is like the merchant ships. She brings her food from afar. She also rises while it is yet night, and provides food for her household, and a portion for her maidservants. She considers a field, and buys it. From her profits, she plants a vineyard. Now, generosity has always been the key in not only Rarity's character, but in the character of what makes up a godly woman in heart, body, soul, and spirit. It's always the key in that you're not afraid of hard work. No, Rarity wasn't necessarily even a bride at this point. I mean, many fanfics would suggest the contrary as to be in the making, but as far as all things go, Rarity was not in a relationship, but she had this as her character and core value. She wasn't so beyond just having everyone do everything for her. She was willing to be career-minded in knowing that she would have to provide for herself, and she didn't necessarily, I mean, she had her semblances of pride and vanity in their own regard, as we all tend to do, but she wasn't afraid of the reality of knowing he who doesn't work doesn't eat. And Rarity just as well preferred the finer things in life and wasn't afraid to seek those things. And we have examples of this culturally. Merchant ships bringing food from afar. She knows the finer tastes. She seeks wool and flax. Those were building materials for roofs, and willingly works with her hands. I think that's self-explanatory. And she rises while it is yet night. She's willing to make sacrifices to get the things that she wants, not only for herself, but for her maidservants and her family, for those who work under her and those that she is working for. And on top of that, from her profits, she buys a vineyard. She's willing to not only go out and make the effort to work, but by that godly example is even trustworthy enough that she doesn't have to check in with her husband every time she's willing to make a bank book decision. She's not writing checks and saying, hold on, I got to confirm this with my husband, and not having to do everything under control. And granted, there are exceptions to this where a husband and a wife both have to have an honest association with each other and saying, look, this is our budget, this is our finances, this is our expenses, but the godly woman basically singles herself out, and that her trustworthiness goes as far as even the way that she provides for her family with her own wages. She's not afraid to do nice things for those that she loves. She's most certainly not considering her needs before others, but she doesn't neglect them either. And note that when we continue to read this. Verse 17, she girds herself with strength and strengthens her arms. Now, we get that common stereotype in referring to girls as the weaker sex. But note, this isn't an insult towards a woman's bearing, but it's more a call of character to men to remember to take care of and protect their spouses and not abandon them. Because you would ask any girl what they're looking for in a relationship, it's not only someone that they could get along with and call their friend, but it's someone that they could trust with their lives and their character. And I'm sure anyone would be a testimony to agree to that. They need someone that they can trust just as much as appreciate their company. And by considering them weak, it's not lessening you, it's encouraging us to recognize we have a calling in your lives too. And the same thing is true for Rarity here, in that Spike was willing to do some labor to help her out as well. It wasn't necessarily for Rarity's sake in being unable to lift these things. I'm sure she could have done it much more efficiently with the magic, but Spike was willing to support Rarity in this by pulling the wagon and carrying the gems, and she was willing to reward and pay him and take care of her servants, those who worked under her. The same was also true. We see these little snippets of wisdom and all of these things applied. Note, whether or not you think Rarity is best pony or not, it goes into the logic that where Rarity was called to be was not to be in a position of being weaker, but she needed help, and she wasn't afraid to ask for it. And a godly woman has strength and prepares herself for the work that she knows she has to do. But she's not willing to go into any fight alone, because it doesn't matter how strong you are, there will always be someone stronger than you, and that is why a twofold cord keeps warm at night. And granted, in the term of husband and wife, that's more ways than one, but I digress. Verse 18. Actually, you know what? Before we continue, I also want to make the point of also saying that when Rarity, there were interesting words. Gird. That's actually a term back in, this was being written to Israeli culture. Even the guys and girls both wore dresses. And especially when guys needed to work, they'd always use the term gird up their loins, prepare themselves, because, well, running in a dress, doesn't matter which side of the gender you're on, it never looks good and rarely ends well. So when you'd gird something up, you'd actually bundle it up. It's basically just making sure those things wouldn't get caught in the combine, so to speak. If you can understand where I'm coming from, it's preparing yourself. It's kind of giving some room for your knees to run so that it becomes a mini skirt, not a traffic hazard. But then likewise with this, when you're strengthening yourself, it's making the effort of not knowing where reality is going, but just not being overwhelmed by it either. When Rarity was given an order that was well beyond her means and ability, I mean, you saw her eye was twitching. She was just, I have to make 4 more of those dresses, I think it was. Well, she recognized that there was an issue here, but that didn't stop her. She knew she had strength. That's why she also requested help. But bringing all of these points back, note that the term strength doesn't mean that you can handle everything on your own. But it also means don't consider yourself weak either. That's the key point that's being made here. Well, verse 18, she perceives that her merchandise is good, and her lamp does not go out by night. She doesn't waste her time calling on and correcting all of her work in false humility, thinking that by tearing herself down, it's somehow building up something better. By creating a vacuum, she's calling in compliments and attention that she feels that she needs. She's not the kind of person to neglect someone who needs help. Her lamp does not go out by night. She's willing to help those who need her. And this is more ways than one, whether it's referring to her children, whether it's referring to people who would just come into town and need a place to stay. She's always ready and willing to help someone who needs her regardless of where she's at, and saying, you know what, I need some rest. That person got run over, well, someone will call 911. You can't hear that screaming? It goes back into character and integrity being your foundation. Not saying you always do the right thing, but it's making the effort in that being, if no one else will, I will already be there. And that's a value that even a guy would want to exemplify. It's definitely something that a guy would admire. Verse 19, she stretches out her hands to the distaff, and her hand holds the spindle. Again, more cultural references here. A distaff and a spindle were both tools meant for grinding bread. When it was taken into the grain, it was like more of a handmade tool, where you weren't doing these things large for factories and throwing up wheat and chaff and then basically kneading all the dough and putting it out in mass production to be sold on the market. A distaff and a spindle were basically just something meant to make small orders for home products and consumption. So by making this analogy, it's saying that, well, you aren't above even the lowest grade of work. There is that very degrading and common stereotype of saying, oh, well, the woman in the kitchen, that's her home habitat. That's not what it's saying at all. But it's repeating that point that we saw in Rarity, and that when she was hungry, there wasn't something too far above her that she was willing to do. Well, I'm not going to go out into the dirt. I have Spike for that. Well, she knew she had limits to what she was capable of doing, but it didn't stop her from doing what she had to do. She used her talents, And especially when the diamond dogs told her, well, you're going to find the jewels and then dig. Well, she didn't stop herself from digging, but she also knew that her abilities were that and rather limited. It's not negating or contradicting the strength that came before it, and it's also not building on that stereotype, but it's just saying if you need something to be done, you aren't above such things. You don't hold yourself to that higher standard that you exempt yourself from taking care of yourself. Granted, in most cases, people would be glad to take care of you. Spike was in that way. But it didn't mean that likewise when she was isolated by the diamond dogs, that she wasn't able to handle herself. In fact, that was the whole point of the episode, is that she had more strength than people gave her credit for. Or ponies in this case. Verse 20. I think it's self-explanatory. She extends her hands to the poor. Yes, she reaches out her hands to the needy. Verse 21. She is not afraid of snow for her household is clothed with scarlet. She makes tapestry for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. I'm sure these cultural references are starting to weigh a little bit on your head here. Okay, her family doesn't have to worry during winter because their clothings are red, but you can also remember she wears purple. What does that mean? Well, quite a lot actually. This is reflecting that idea that when difficult times naturally come, why the example is used of snow, something that was naturally seasonal, especially in the Israeli desert, snow does happen, but they're prepared for it because she's not only taking care of her family, they have clothes worn for winter occasions, which are rare, but they happen, but she's only settled for the best. Because scarlet dye, that red dye, was actually a very expensive commodity. The Phoenician traders, which were a part of the it was basically a major world power that had a lot of naval ports that traded between Israel and Greece and Turkey and Cyrene and all of these various places. They had access to these things, but the only way that they would get scarlet dye was actually through specific stuff that you would get from areas in Egypt and in the northern areas, and it was only exclusive to Israel. And because of these things, it was just giving the illustration that she didn't settle for less or half effort. The thrift store wasn't her first stop when it came to providing for the things she knew her family needed. There was nothing too good for those that she loved. But likewise, note, scarlet for her home, but she also makes tapestry for herself, and her clothing is fine linen and purple. Now, purple, well, that was like the highest expense of items because it was not only exclusive only to certain areas and coastal regions in the Mediterranean Sea, but the only way you could get the purple dye that they used back in that day, because they didn't have artificial coloring or ink, was by squeezing the juice and lifeblood out of these oysters, which were specifically bred off of the coast of what would be Philippi and coastal cities north, really far north of Israel. So purple was basically the clothing that was only bought by kings. It was the supermodel finance shoppers' items. It was the thing that only the wealthiest of the wealthiest, the famous people, would be wearing purple. And I think this illustrates very well. She only settles for the best for her family, and nothing is too good for those that she loves, but she also doesn't neglect keeping the best for herself. And note, the Bible doesn't condemn this, but it says she takes care of her family first, then she gets the best for herself. Only after that those she loves is taken care of. Note, that's oftentimes the part that we neglect. Well, as long as I'm more than taken care of, then I'd be more than happy to take care of others. The Bible says once those of her household are taken care of, the godly woman spares no expense in making sure that she looks good as well. And I think that's a fair deal when it comes to the personality of a woman. They want to have the finer things in life, but the main point of all of this is integrity and character. She's not doing it to the neglect of those around her. Verse 23. Her husband is known at the gates, and when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them, and supplies sashes for the merchants. Again, a lot of cultural references here, but recognize what the main point is. No man's value is established more than the word of his wife. You have more power over us, ladies, than you give yourself credit for, but you don't want to take advantage of that. It's actually a very close friend of mine and brother in the Lord who once said, the closer that you are to somebody, the more capability you have of hurting them. I think that makes sense. I mean, the assassin's knife works no better than if you're the closest person to them. You're sleeping with the enemy, so to speak. And you recognize when you have that place in our hearts, you are given more power and authority and emotional influence over us that could ever be even compared to than even our family members. And that power is not to be underestimated, because just like you have the capability to destroy us, when you build us up, it's equally as influential in how you interact with us and how we are viewed among our friends as well. Because no guy wants to be made fun of by his wife behind his back. He can tell when he's just being devalued by the person who should be literally the second half of his soul. When you share in that relationship and that bond in any set of circumstance, and ladies, even if you aren't in a relationship, recognize the people that you surround yourself with take more influence from you than they would from most other people, because you have been given that by God. And that's not something to be abused. Recognize that in saying what you do good for others makes more than you give it credit for, but what you do bad for others is likewise the same. Strength and honor are her clothing. She shall rejoice in the time to come. Now, I know a lot of girls in my life that take great value and pride in recognizing that it's not only in body image, but I want to honor the body that God gave me by taking good care of it. And we have marathon runners and triathletes and bodybuilders, but there comes a point when you just kind of look at a woman's body that really questions the resemblance on whether or not it's a man based off of the only way you would tell is if by the clothing that they were wearing. You recognize that by it referring to strength and honor being her clothing, it's something that she wears with pride, not necessarily something that makes up who they are. You aren't called to make that sacrifice and literally defining your body and your image based off of your strength and capability to do things. That's what you have guys for. Just saying, you ask anyone to do some of the more difficult stuff. It's not a matter of you being weak or taking advantage of people and likewise being unable to do these things, but you carry yourself and take care of yourself in that way that it is just as much a part of you as the clothing that you put on. It is something that defines your image in saying, my honor is my clothing and my strength is my gown. My jewelry is simply defined by my integrity, and it's by that alone that I shine. Does that make sense? So strength and honor are her clothing. She shall rejoice in the time to come. She knows that these things will pay off, because it goes to the next verse. Verse 26 says, she opens her mouth with wisdom, and on her tongue is the law of kindness. It speaks for itself. Her mind and mouth are both set on the things that honor God, and her hope comes from that exact same source. When you take these things into heart and account, we may not necessarily have them or attain them, but remember that these things are the end result and where God's will is for you to end up and where you will be when you see him face to face. And that you set and define yourself. You speak and encourage others, not through your own insight, which can often slip in as passive-aggressive or even mean the things that you didn't intend to. But if someone's going to misinterpret you or be insulted by you, it's not your fault. It's theirs. The same thing is true for how it is portrayed in God's Word, and that God's calling in your life is that the way you have influence in our lives and emotions, the way that you present and carry yourself, and the way that God works in your life as your beloved and bridegroom, your comforter and your friend, and the only one, even above your husband, that will ever be the one to truly have your heart, that is where the true value lies. It's not from without, but within. Verse 27, she watches over the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Mostly self-explanatory, right? The home is a foundation for the future. And where a mom has her place and a unique calling by God to remember and care for the things that truly matter, whether it's getting the kids to soccer practice, whether it's remembering that date night, making the kids' birthdays special, or even simply taking the time. If you don't have a relationship, you don't plan to be married, I don't need a man. Well, you still have parents, and as their daughter and their precious little girl, regardless of the relationship you have, you don't realize the impact that you make in going on and living life well and recognizing I have continued to pave a road that is going to be a foundation in which the King would gladly travel. You're furthering the kingdom of God simply by the way that you carry yourself, and that the foundation that you set in your home, you watch well over it, regardless of whether there's a husband or a full family or a together household, or whether you're even considered stable or not. You watch over the ways of your household, and you aren't given over to laziness. Rarity was the same way in this episode, and you all can recognize that. While she wasn't perfect in every regard, she knew how to handle herself and had no worries for the future. Her anxiety was not built up as far as what everyone assumed that she would be, not touching mud unless it was imported, or being the genteel lady that was just stereotypically given to her based off of her personality. But when she had to, she went back to her roots in remembering, I stand on stable ground because I was the one who set it there. And knowing that you are the foundation for the household is not necessarily saying you rule over everyone, but you make sure that everyone is stable. And remember that when mamas ain't happy, nobody happy. You aren't the leader of the household, and that's not degrading you, because you have a far more important job. You're the sanity of the household. Remember that. Verse 28. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many daughters have done well, but you excel them all. I think Proverbs 27 and verse 2 explains this the best. It says, let another praise you and not your own mouth, a stranger and not your own lips. When you go around parading on how well you've lived your life, we honestly call it into question because it's just showing off. Rarity didn't necessarily do this 100% in the episode, but like I said before, integrity, character, her actions spoke for themselves. She didn't need to prove anything because her family bore and lived that testimony and were the result of her hard work and investment. And that by that soul's payoff, she was able to serve the Lord. And it was based on all of that we get the most important verse that any of you girls will ever hear in your entire lives, coming directly from the mouth of God. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is passing. But a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. The true glory of a godly woman is in her character and in her heart. Her eyes are set on God and not on herself, and no one looks the same as they did when they were 20. But most people, sadly, often act the same way throughout their entire lives as if they were 16. You can't help them, but don't let that be you. That's the only thing you can control. It's what's more important, what's on the inside. It's how the diamond receives light that makes it shine. The difference between a gray stone and a silver rock is determined by its value and how it shines its glory, whether it takes it in for itself or it shines it out back. And what truly makes it last isn't that it burns itself out, trying to take in as much to preserve itself as possible, but in the time that it's given, regardless of whether you age well. You have to use plastic surgery to keep yourself together, or you don't feel beautiful because you weren't that person that you used to be, even though you said the same thing when you were that age and the person that I'm going to be, or vice versa, and you can't take care of yourself the same way before. It's all irrelevant because there is something more important. It's not what you carry on you, it's what you're carrying with you when your King comes for you. Because Revelation 19 says the bride of Christ is clothed with fine linen, which are the righteous acts of the saints. You are preparing your wedding dress today. And I guarantee you, every girl's dream, regardless of whether she wants to pursue that in her life or not, at one point had the greatest dream of her wedding being the day where she's just clothed as a beautiful bride. And there is no more better picture of heaven than her entrance, being welcomed in the arms of Jesus, clothed with her life, shining in the light of the King, and knowing that she wasn't perfect, but in where she falled, her bridegroom covered it with his blood and has made her clean. And in what she has, even more will be given to her, because her value isn't in herself, but it's in what God says about her. It's what God is making her into. That's where verse 31 becomes key. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her at the gates. Rarity's prowess and praise came from her character. And at the end of this episode, as a pony, she simply was who she was. And that is what made her worthy of praise at the end of the episode, when she overcame an enemy simply by maintaining her honor, even though there were some sly moves. All is fair in love and war. Even though Spike felt that she'd be helpless when he came to her rescue and was surprised when he found her, kind of running the show, rather, running things in her own way. The godly woman knows where her strength lies. The godly woman knows where her value lies. And as far as where Rarity is concerned, it all goes back to verse 10. She is worth far more than rubies. And remember, that's coming from God's mouth. So don't let it be what others tell you. Don't let it be what the diamond dogs tell you. Let it be what your Father says about you. And those words have been set in stone for well over thousands of years, and that's not likely to change. Thank you for your time, everyone, in listening to this study, and I hope you guys have gotten something beneficial out of it. If you have any questions or want extended points on the verses that we've covered in this study, leave them in the comments below. I'd be more than happy to discuss them with you. If you were blessed by this study and want to see the channel grow, please share it on Facebook or with anyone that you think will be blessed by it in turn. And all in all, thank you for your time. God bless you.